War takes everything from a man, his peace, his sleep, his sense of time. But the one thing it couldn't take from me was my family. Or at least, that's what I thought. When I was deployed overseas, the world around me turned into a living nightmare. Gunfire, explosions, and the constant weight of death pressed down on me like a boulder I could never shake off. The only thing that kept me sane, that kept me breathing when everything told me to give up, was the thought of my wife, Emily, and my parents back home. I would lie awake at night, gripping the worn photograph of them, Emily smiling beside me, my mother and father standing behind us, all of us frozen in time before I left for my first tour. I told myself, if I die here, it means never seeing them again. It means never holding Emily, never hugging Mom, never having a beer with Dad. So I pushed on. I fought through the pain, the exhaustion, the fear. Because no matter how dark it got, I believed there was still light waiting for me at home. Then the day came. After months of hell, I was finally on a plane back to the States. My body was intact, but my soul felt like it had been left behind in the sand and smoke. The only thing pulling me forward was the idea that soon I'd be back in Emily's arms, back at the house we built together, back where I belong. But the moment I stepped off that plane, something felt wrong. My family wasn't there. Emily wasn't there. Just silence, like I'd already died and no one had noticed. And that's when everything began to fall apart. I stood there, scanning the crowd, my heart pounding harder than it ever had in combat. Other soldiers were rushing into the arms of their loved ones, wives, children, parents. Laughter, sobs of relief, hands gripping each other like they'd never let go again. But for me, there was nothing. No Emily. No Mom. No Dad. At first, I told myself there had to be a mistake. Maybe they got the date wrong. Maybe something came up. Maybe Emily was waiting at home with a surprise. I clung to those thoughts the way I had clung to my rifle overseas, like my life depended on them. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the exit, forcing down the dread rising in my chest. I called Emily's phone. No answer. Called again. Straight to voicemail. I tried my parents. Same result. It wasn't until I stepped into a cab and gave the driver my home address that the sinking feeling truly took hold. The house, our house, looked the same from the outside when I arrived. The white siding, the front porch, the flower beds Emily had planted. But as I walked up the steps, something felt off. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. A nice one. Too nice. I knocked. Waited. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. Then the door opened. And the man standing there wasn't me. Tall, well-dressed, relaxed in a way that said he belonged there. His eyes flicked over me, confused, like I was the stranger. And then, before I could speak, I heard her voice from inside. "Babe, who is it?" My world cracked open like a fault line splitting the earth. Emily. Her voice was light, casual. Happy. Like she wasn't expecting me home. Like she hadn't thought about me at all. For a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was like my body had shut down, refusing to process what was happening. Emily appeared behind the man, wearing one of my old t-shirts, the same one she used to sleep in when she missed me. But now, she was standing in our home, in my clothes, next to someone else. And the way she looked at me, wide-eyed, frozen in place, told me everything. She hadn't expected me back. The man glanced between us, still confused. "Emily?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. That's when it hit him. That's when he realized exactly who I was. My stomach clenched, bow rising in my throat. "Who the hell is this?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice raw with something between rage and disbelief. Emily opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. Then she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around herself like she was cold. "Daniel," she whispered. You weren't supposed to be back yet." That was all she had to say. Not "oh my God, you're home?" Not "I missed you." Just a panicked admission that she hadn't been expecting me to walk through that door. The man's expression hardened, like he was putting something together in his head. You're her husband? He asked, his tone now cautious. I didn't even look at him. My eyes were locked on Emily, waiting, begging, for her to tell me there was some kind of mistake. Some kind of explanation. But she just stood there, silent, her lips trembling. And that's when I knew. While I was out there risking my life, barely surviving, thinking of her to stay alive, she had moved on. She had let another man into our home, into our bed. And now she was looking at me like I was the intruder. I stepped back, the weight of it all crashing down on me. Where are my parents? I asked, my voice shaking. Emily hesitated. Then she whispered, They know. The world dropped out from under me. My breath caught in my throat. They know. I wanted to believe she was lying. That my parents, my own flesh and blood, would never betray me like this. That they would have told me, warned me. But the way Emily looked at me, the way her arms stayed wrapped around herself like she was bracing for a storm, told me everything. She wasn't lying. My mind raced. My parents had always loved Emily. They treated her like a daughter. But they loved me too. Didn't they? I pulled my phone out again and called my dad. The dial tone rang once. Twice. Then it picked up. A breath of relief was about to leave me, until I heard his voice. Cold. Distant. Not the dad I remembered. Daniel, he said like my name was a burden in his mouth. Dad, I breathed. I'm home. What the hell is going on? A pause. Then a heavy sigh. You shouldn't have come back. It felt like a gunshot to the chest. I stumbled back a step, gripping my phone tighter. What? You've been gone a long time, son, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Things change. You need to accept that. Accept that my wife is sleeping with another man? That you knew and didn't tell me? My voice cracked, a mix of anger and heartbreak. How could you do this to me? Another silence. This one longer. Then he said the words that shattered me. She's not your wife anymore, Daniel. You were dead to her a long time ago. I clenched my jaw, fighting back the sting behind my eyes. Dead? I repeated, my voice hollow. Emily shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. The man beside her had crossed his arms, watching me like I was some stray dog refusing to leave. Dad, please. I tried one last time, my voice barely a whisper. I have nowhere to go. But all he said was, You'll figure it out. Then the line went dead. I stood there, staring at my phone, the world around me a blur. My parents, the people who raised me, who I fought to stay alive for, had turned their backs on me. Emily had erased me from her life. And now I was standing on the doorstep of a house that was no longer mine. I had survived war. But at that moment, I wasn't sure I would survive this. I don't remember how long I stood there, gripping my phone like it was the only thing keeping me upright. My own father had told me I was dead to him. My wife, ex-wife, I realized with a bitter taste in my mouth, had moved on, and my parents had accepted it without a second thought. I was a ghost in my own life. Emily shifted again, looking uncomfortable. The man beside her finally spoke. Look, man, he said, his voice laced with fake sympathy. I think it's best if you just leave. I turned my head toward him slowly, my blood boiling. Every instinct in my body told me to swing, to knock that self-satisfied expression off his face, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain I was drowning in. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. This wasn't the battlefield. This wasn't war. This was worse. I swallowed hard and looked at Emily one last time. How long? I asked, my voice raw. She hesitated, like she wanted to lie but knew there was no point. A year, she finally admitted, her eyes dropping to the floor. A year. So while I was still in hell, still waking up to the sound of explosions, still dreaming about coming home to her, she was already gone. Already in bed with someone else. And my parents had known. They had known and let it happen. Something inside me broke. I exhaled slowly and turned away from the house that was no longer mine. My legs felt heavy as I walked back down the driveway, each step hammering the reality deeper into my skull. No wife. No family. No home. I barely noticed the way the sky had darkened, or how the cold wind bit through my uniform. I just walked. My bag slung over my shoulder, my heart a dead weight in my chest. I pulled my phone out one last time. Scrolled through my contacts. There was no one left to call. No one left at all. The streets were empty as I walked, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder like dead weight. I had nowhere to go, no plan, no purpose. The uniform I once wore with pride now felt like a joke. What was the point of surviving war if I had nothing to come back to? I stopped at a bus stop, sitting down on the cold metal bench, trying to think. But my mind kept circling the same thought. They were all I had, and they threw me away. Emily had moved on. My parents had accepted it. To them, I was already gone, just a name on a gravestone they never had to carve. The anger came in waves, each one stronger than the last. I had bled for this country, sacrificed years of my life, and for what? To come home and be treated like I never existed? I clenched my fists, staring at the cracked pavement beneath my boots, willing the rage to settle. It didn't. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows as the night crept in. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten in hours. But food was the last thing on my mind. I had no home. No family. No job. No car. The military had trained me to survive in war zones, to push through exhaustion, hunger, and pain. But they never prepared me for this. I dug into my pocket, pulled out the few crumpled bills I had left, and let out a bitter laugh. Not enough for a motel. Maybe enough for a cheap meal. I glanced at my phone again, scrolling through my contacts. Every name felt like a stranger. Old friends had moved on. Military buddies were scattered across the country. And the only people I wanted, needed, had abandoned me. I was completely, utterly alone. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know how to fight my way out. The night stretched long and cold. I walked through the city like a ghost, past glowing signs and busy streets where people laughed and lived their lives. Lives that weren't shattered like mine. I ended up at a diner, the kind that stayed open late for drunks and lost souls. I sat in a booth by the window, ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a black coffee and a slice of stale pie, and tried to figure out my next move. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, poured my coffee and gave me a once-over. "Long day?" she asked. I nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Something like that." She didn't ask more, just refilled my cup when it got low. Maybe she recognized the look in my eyes. The look of someone with nowhere to go. I pulled out my phone again, staring at the dark screen. I could call someone from my old unit, but what would I say? "Hey man, just got back from deployment and found out my wife cheated, my parents disowned me, and I'm homeless. Got a couch?" No. That wasn't me. I wasn't going to beg. Instead, I searched for shelters, cheap motels, anything. The options were bleak. Most places were either full or in neighborhoods where I'd be better off sleeping in a ditch. My mind drifted back to my parents. My childhood home. The warm kitchen, the smell of my mom's cooking, my dad teaching me how to fix an old truck. All of it felt like a dream now, something that belonged to another man. I gritted my teeth. They turned their backs on me. Maybe it was time I did the same. I didn't have a home anymore. Didn't have a family. But I was still breathing. And as long as I was alive, I had one thing left. A mission. I didn't know what it was yet. But I was damn sure going to find it. I sat in that diner until the coffee went cold and the weight in my chest settled into something sharp, something solid. Grief had no place in war, and right now, I was in a new kind of battle. One where the enemy wasn't holding a rifle. It was the emptiness stretching in front of me. I needed a plan. First, shelter. I found a rundown motel a few blocks away, the kind where the walls were thin, and the sheets probably hadn't been washed in weeks. It didn't matter. It had a door that locked, and that was enough. I paid cash at the front desk, my funds running dangerously low. Once inside, I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The silence was different here. It wasn't the silence of the desert, of waiting for the next explosion. It was the silence of being forgotten. I needed work. Fast. The military had given me a skill set, but not one that translated well to civilian life. Nobody needed a guy who knew how to clear a building or operate heavy artillery. But I could handle security. Maybe construction. Anything that kept my hands busy, kept my mind from spiraling. I pulled out my phone and started searching. A few leads popped up, nothing great, but enough to get me started. Then, against my better judgment, I checked Emily's social media. She had erased me. No pictures of us, no mention of me. It was like I had never existed. Instead, there were new pictures, her and him, smiling at parties, on vacations, living a life I wasn't part of. I clenched my jaw and shut off my phone. I had spent months in war holding on to the idea of home, of love, of them. But they had moved on without me. Fine. I would do the same. Because if there was one thing the military taught me, it was how to survive. The morning came with stiff joints and the dull ache of exhaustion. I hadn't slept much, old habits from deployment, but it didn't matter. I had a mission now, rebuild from nothing. I left the motel and walked for miles, following up on job postings. Some places barely looked at me. Others saw my military background and assumed I was broken, unstable. One guy, a security manager at a warehouse, actually said, "No offense, man, but we don't need any PTSD cases around here." I wanted to hit him. Instead, I turned around and walked out. By noon, my stomach was growling, but my money was running too low to waste on food yet. I had to be smart. I sat on a bench, watching the city move around me, and for the first time in days, I let my mind settle. I thought about my parents. About how easily they had let me go. Maybe they had never really understood me. Maybe they had never wanted a soldier for a son. I had spent years making them proud, serving my country, believing they'd always be there when I came home. But they hadn't been. They had chosen her. The betrayal burned, but I wouldn't let it break me. By late afternoon I got lucky. A construction site needed extra hands. It was grunt work, hauling supplies, clearing debris, but they paid cash at the end of each day. No background checks, no questions. I took it. The first swing of the sledgehammer against concrete sent a shock up my arms, rattling my bones. But it felt good. Something about the raw power of it, the way each hit shattered something, mirrored the wreckage inside me. I worked until my muscles screamed. Until the only thing I could think about was the weight of the hammer, and the next swing. When the shift ended, I pocketed my cash, wiped the sweat from my face, and exhaled. For the first time since coming home, I felt something close to control. The days blurred together after that. Wake up. Work until my body ached. Eat just enough to keep going. Sleep in that cheap motel, listening to the hum of the city through thin walls. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I stopped checking my phone. There was no reason to. My parents weren't going to call. Emily had already erased me. There was nothing left for me in the past. One night after work, I sat on the motel bed, staring at my hands, calloused, bruised, covered in dust. These hands were meant for more than this. I thought about my brothers in arms, the ones who had made it back, and the ones who hadn't. Some of us had survived war, but not all of us survived coming home. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't the only one struggling, the only one left behind. The next day, after work, I walked into a local veterans center. The place was rundown, nothing fancy. A few guys sat around, nursing cups of coffee, staring at the walls. I recognized the look in their eyes. I asked the man at the front desk if they needed volunteers. He just looked at me and said, "Always." That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt something real, purpose. I had spent so much time fighting for people who had given up on me. My parents. Emily. But there were others out there who still needed someone in their corner. Soldiers who had come home only to find there was nothing left. I wasn't dead. I was still here. And if no one else was going to fight for me, then I'd fight for them. Because that's what soldiers do.